Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Black Lawyers Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Kara Bolden, Justice Kara Bolden, actually. And we're just so excited to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I make all my guests play legal hot topics before we jump into their specific journey and their questions. And today, the hot topics surround two issues. The first issue being gun legislation. Recently, there was a national shooter that shot three children and three adults. And so, as usual, we're sorry to hear that once again, a school is, affected by gun violence. And it just seems like it keeps happening. You have Sandy Hook, you have all these various schools that face this sort of school violence. And so we just wanted to hear your thoughts. We understand that you're a judge and you have to remain neutral, but if you could maybe walk our audience through maybe from a legislator perspective, why is it so difficult for them to get something on the books so that maybe each state has something they can pull from in terms of helping to prevent future school shooting?
Sure. Well, first, I am a judge or a justice, and so I don't have a personal opinion on the legislation. However, if it may come to my desk, the law is the law. I think the conversation tends to be around uh, the individual Second Amendment rights and how much can be regulated surrounding that issue. And so, that difference of opinion, I think, has caused the conversation to kind of happen over and over again as we see these instances happening. And I just want to stop and say, I thoughts and prayers to everyone affected, and everyone that has lost their lives and their families that are reeling with the ramifications of this. I have a 7-month-old, and I can't imagine what it might be like to send her to school and to lose her. But the conversation typically starts and stops from my experience in being in the legislature of at what point do you infringe upon individuals' Second Amendment rights? And that's something that the legislatures are going to have to continue to have conversations about and grapple with.
To your understanding, would it have to be state by state? Like each state would have to come up with their own rule, or is it because it is the Second Amendment, it would have to be a federal rule that everyone would have to follow, even if they were able to, like you said, actually come up with something they could agree to?
Well, each state has their own regulations surrounding the use of firearms. Michigan differs a little bit from the federal level. Obviously, the individuals in Congress could create some federal legislation if they wanted to that the states would have to adhere to. So I think it's a combination. It could just be states individually. It could be federal. The federal government can kick it to the states, and there are a lot of different things that can happen when we're talking about legislation. But it's a conversation that again Congress will have to grapple with, and I think individual states as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I was gonna say you are a new mom, so I forgot that. And my prayers are out to the families as well. I think forget her real name. I always go by the actress's name. Her name is, I think on the show, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the Melissa
Oh,
something.
yes,
I saw
yes.
it on Shable,
For
but
Joan
I
Hart,
I was in tears because she said that, I mean, she's out of the spotlight, obviously. She's no longer on that show, but she was actually near Sandy Hook when it happened. And then they moved, and now they're in Nashville, and then this happened
wow.
nearby. So they literally helped kindergartners. I guess they had to cut from the back of the school through like a forest area to get them out. I don't know how it happened, but her and her husband were driving nearby. and help kindergartners.
Wow.
So it just broke my heart. I said, oh, wow, I've been reading so many stories about what transpired, specifically in Nashville. And that one just really just took me like over I was just like, oh my God, this is just too much. So my hope, like you said, I mean, it could be state, it could be federal, but I definitely think, like you said, without infringing upon the right to bear arms, because there's a reason why that was put in the Constitution, and I can respect why someone would want to protect themselves, right? So I personally, I'm not a judge, so I can say this. I don't personally, you know, not understand that perspective that you should want to protect yourself. I think it's like you said, like the limits on that, so that everyone is protected, and finding that balance. And so good luck Congress, good luck senators, good luck judges. I'm just not sure where we can land, but I am hoping for the best for that particular issue. So moving on, another hot topic issue is critical race theory. All of a sudden, this has been something I feel like you heard about it kind of long time ago, but not like really. And I feel like now that elections are coming up, all of a sudden, especially from the Republican, I know camp, you'll hear things about critical race theory. And so recently, if you guys are listening, you may have seen on various news outlets that there are different schools in different states that are starting to have meetings for their K through 12 about any classes that are related to critical race theory. And, obviously you have some parents on the side of like, let's just leave all politics kind of like out of schools. We don't want anything like having to do with politics. And then, you obviously have the other side that it's important that there's diversity in education. So, you have these two staunch standpoints. I know up until this point, I thought it was something more taught in colleges, and so it would be an elective. So it wouldn't even matter. It's like either you wanted to take it or you didn't. And so I just wanted to hear just like your thoughts on what's happening with it being discussed with the K through 12 schools at this juncture.
Yeah, well, my first question is if someone could define critical race theory for me, that would help me a lot. Because, like you, I thought it was a legal course taught in some law schools or a graduate level course. So I think that I personally need help understanding exactly what the issue might be. Um, but again, being a judge, if anything comes to my desk, I have to look at it with a neutral and unbiased eyes. But I will say that the Supreme Court has a DEI commission, which I am very proud of, in order to increase the amount of judges and lawyers from diverse backgrounds. Also, how can we make the justice system more equitable? Um, and and to, quite frankly, to limit or end the amount of discrimination that folks see when they come before the court. And so I'm very proud of the work that the Michigan Supreme Court is doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I hope that that work expands and really has some great outcomes for individuals in Michigan.
Well, I said, you know what? She's asking, why don't I look it up? I just looked it up, and it's interesting because it actually speaks to a lot of what you just said. So, critical race theory, according to the official definition, they said the core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in our legal systems and our policies. So that is what it's obviously surrounding. And so I guess any sort of, you know, um, I guess history course or any government course, anything that could be related to speaking to what I just spoke about, I guess would fall under what they consider critical race theory. And so yeah, you could have a class taught I don't see it being taught to a kindergartner, but I do see it being taught maybe to a high schooler. I could see that being a class. So that still kind of falls in that K through 12. Um, so yeah, it's just interesting that just like all of a sudden there's just been this explosion of this, pushback. But I'm loving what I'm hearing about what Michigan is doing. I know you can only speak for Michigan because you're in Michigan, and I'm sure there's some other states that are working to make sure their schools have as much, diversity as possible. I mean, at the end of the day, you are a product, right? You are a product of what diversity looks like. You are the first, first black female justice for Michigan. So, I think people that look like you, people look like me, we understand that yes, a lot of what happens is already embedded in our systems, in our education, in our abilities to get jobs and things like that. And so, wherever you stand on the issue, I think we can all agree that things are embedded. And so anyway, it had come up, and like you said, I was equally a little confused because I'm like, why are you talking about this through K through 12? And I think what it is, it's this overarching topic, right? And then like any course that could be related to it, now they're just like you said, they're just throwing. I think they probably say African American studies. It was critical race theory. I think they're just throwing now everything under that umbrella, and I think that's what's confusing. So I personally think would be helpful, which you just mentioned, is that they really outline what really applies under that category versus what doesn't. And I think at that point, then schools will have less angry parents because I do think there is some general confusion around what it actually is, and what applies and what classes and what grades and things like that. I think it could be helpful if each state were to outline it.
Yeah, and what I will say is I have told my family history, my story very broadly. I am the great granddaughter of a lynching victim in Tennessee. My great grandfather asked a store owner for a receipt, and a lynch mob ensued. And he was beaten and castrated and thrown into the local river. And the coroner deemed it an accidental drowning. And as a result of that determination, his murderers were acquitted. And I tell this story a lot, and people ask me, is it difficult, or because it does get brought up a lot. But I think these stories are important to share because people ask me, why do you think you're the first Black woman in 2023 to serve on the Michigan Supreme Court? And I share my family's history. My family's history is not uncommon to Black people. They just may not know.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about progress, we also talk about the number of Black attorneys there are. Let's just start there.
5%. I said a million times for this progress.
Yeah, less than now. A new study came out. It's decreasing.
Oh no.
How do we expect for Black people to be in these powerful positions when we're less than 5% of attorneys, and a lot of us in our families have traumatic histories where we have family members that were unjustly taken from our homes. We talk about generational wealth. Well, how do you have that when you have lynchings and Jim Crow and trying to pull your family out of the effects of slavery? Redlining. I mean, we can go on, right?
Right. You're just saying it trickles.
I mean, it has generational effects. I am so fortunate that my grandmother found the resolve, and I went to her college graduation. So she was obviously an adult, and I was an adult. And to see my grandmother get her college degree, and to know that I'm the first Black woman on the Michigan Supreme Court after my great grandfather was lynched. I think those stories need to be told because that is an important part of my story. That is one of the reasons why I decided to pursue justice in the first place. So if you look at me and you see my age and
Right.
all these things, and if some people say, "Oh, she's a diversity hire," and all these things, well, no, my family's past caused me to work extremely hard so that families would see justice in a way that my family didn't see justice, and I take that to heart. And so I know you'll ask me about my journey, but I just think that these stories are so important to be told because it tells the whole story of an individual and how they got to where they are.
Well, you actually answered one of my initial questions, so thank you. I was going to ask, did your father, your grandfather's history, all the things that you mentioned that happened to your family, did that, how did that help shape you in terms of wanting to become a lawyer? But you've answered it so briefly, like, I mean, beautifully, like they were denied justice. That is what encouraged you to seek justice. One impacted the other. And so, yeah, I definitely think these stories have to be told. Like you said, these stories are not being told to offend or make people feel guilty or, you know, I think a lot of times race comes down to it's a power thing, like who has the control, who has the narrative, who has whatever power, like you said, is immediately associated with money, right? And so that's why it gets so contentious. But just because you're telling your story about how it led you down your path and where you are, it doesn't make someone else's story less whatever, right? And so I think that that was a very beautiful way to put it. And, I know your ancestors, alive and not alive, are just smiling down on you because you are the dream realized. I think maybe they thought at some point this country would turn, they probably would be a part of it, but you are a shining example of a dream realized. So I think that was just such a beautiful way that you put it. And so, you have your canned answer if somebody tries to challenge you on why you speak about your history as much as you do. And we encourage you here on the podcast to continue to speak about that history.
Absolutely.
So with that being said, I do want to transition into some more personal questions about yourself. Before you were the justice, before you were the lawyer, who were you? Where were you born and raised? What were your interests? Who were you before?
Yeah. So I grew up in a city called Southfield in Michigan. And even when I'm speaking outside in Michigan, when I'm speaking outside of this particular podcast, I always start with that because it was so important to my upbringing. So Southfield is a majority minority community. So about 70% of the population are Black, and it's also a middle class community. So when I grew up, my pediatrician was Black, my dentist was Black, so many doctors, lawyers, business owners were Black. And so I never grew up with a complex about what I could and could not be. I saw myself in so many community leaders growing up. And so when I got to college, I went to Grand Valley State University. For those that don't know, it's in the cornfields, like literally. And I had a bit of a culture shock because I had grown up with people that looked like me. It was still very diverse in that we had a very robust Jewish population and a very robust Chaldean population. Chaldean is kind of specific to Michigan. They're also called Assyrian. But I went to college and I realized for the first time that I was a minority. And I know that sounds incredibly crazy, but um, then I realized how people could look at me and not know me, but just because I was Black or I was a woman, how people would see me. So there are about three things that happened in my college career that I think were significant. I'll go through them really quickly.
Mm.
The first thing was I worked for an after school program with AmeriCorps, helping students after school with their homework and things like that. One day, this little girl runs up to me and says, Miss Kyra, say yes. Can girls go to college? And I stopped. I was a little taken aback. I looked at her because this is a little girl that looks like me, right? And I said, of course, girls can go to college. I am a girl. I'm in college. I go to college down the street. You know, I'm telling her all these things. And, you know, and then she turns to the little girl next to her and says, see, I told you. So these two little Black girls were having a conversation about if they could go to college. And we know broadly that they were having a conversation about what they could and could not be. And because I was there as a representation, they knew that at least going to college was possible where they didn't know before. And so I learned the importance of representation where before I had not taken it for granted. I just didn't realize my privilege at that point of having so many people that look like me. There was a gentleman who lived across from one of my friends in an apartment. And one day he came over and said, he put a bandana around his face and said, look, I'm from Detroit. So just for everyone's knowledge, we scheduled an appointment with him the next day to go through all the reasons why that was wrong and inappropriate, offensive, painful, all those things. But it made me realize how folks can see you in a way that may not be true to you, right? Because what he was saying was all the people from Detroit are criminals. I mean, that's really, and that was the gag. And he thought it was funny. Again, we explained to him all the reasons why it was inappropriate, offensive, not funny. But the fact that he thought that that was funny in the first place really gave me insight into how others can view you. Surely that individual is somewhere making decisions about who to hire, right? At this point.
Yeah.
The third thing that happened, which I already discussed, was I had my great grandmother with me until my later college career. I was getting my psychology degree in English. I did not have any plans to be an attorney. That was not my path. I thought I wanted to listen to other people's issues all day and help them fix it, right? But my great grandmother told me the story of my great grandfather, and that coupled with a few other things, and then understanding how important representation is, especially in the legal and the justice field, I was compelled to pursue justice and go into the legal field. So that was kind of me, you know, growing up before becoming a lawyer. I wanted to be a psychologist. And but again, these situations kind of changed the trajectory of my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say this, and I'm sure you already know this, being a practicing attorney at some point, that psychology degree did not go away, because I think, you know, when I am practicing, 80% of what I do is psychology. I feel like I'm the person's
Absolutely.
therapist. Like maybe 20% of it is the law. Like I actually get to be a lawyer. The rest of the time I'm like holding their hand and like talking about their life and trying to keep their emotions you know,
Yes.
intact,
Yes.
especially if you're like doing like family law or like criminal law or things like that. So, but I think all areas of law, you do find yourself as a counselor. So I'm sure you can speak to that. You still kind of was able to use that.
I'm a different type of counselor. Absolutely.
Yes, just a different type of counselor. So you go to law school. What law school did you go to?
University of Detroit Mercy School of
Okay,
Law.
so you went to University of Detroit. So you're there. Um, what did that look like in terms of, you know, the minority representation? Were you once again kind of confronted with, okay, I'm still maybe one of the only few people here?
Which is really interesting because the school is literally in downtown Detroit. And so when I would talk about the systemic barriers to going to law school with administration and other students, they would say, well, there's Black people. And I said, but we are in a majority Black city, and Black students only make up a very small percentage of the people that attend this law school. And so I would have arguments going back and forth, but I was the vice chair of my BALSA chapter. I really loved law school. I know a lot of people hate it. I really felt like I found my tribe, I found my people. I still have very close relationships. Few were in my wedding, and I'm just so thankful for that experience. I really feel like I found myself in law school, and I really, for the first time, felt like this is what I should be doing.
So you just mentioned that obviously overall you felt like you had like a positive experience, even with you still being a minority at the school. Was there ever a situation with either a teacher or student where you maybe felt like you were being treated differently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would say the administration that's there now is completely different. We do have a Black woman dean, so she has definitely made efforts to make the school more inclusive, and I appreciate her for that. But there were definitely situations where we would get pushback, where I would try to rent a room for, or schedule a room for a meeting or some type of event. And they would tell us, either myself through BASA or other organization, that we couldn't do it, but then other organizations were able to do certain things. And so, it was
It's like you were taking a mental note, like, I
I
wonder why they're
was.
saying me no, telling
It
me
was.
no, and
I
them yes.
was. I might have even taken real notes because we're in law school, right? You can't do these types of things, and so I definitely took notes as to and met with the administration and said, okay, on this date and time, you let this organization have this type of program with this amount of people, but when I requested something similar or less than, you denied it. If you could help me understand the thought process, that would be great.
No, I think that was the perfect way to do it. Let them explain what the difference is, which I'm sure they really couldn't come up with anything. But I love that you even in law school, we were holding people accountable. That just makes me smile from ear to ear. Um, while you were in school, what was your favorite law school class and your least favorite law school?
That is a very good question. I started out loving contracts. Contracts was my jam. um, I would say my least favorite, and I don't think it was because of the class. I think it was the way that it was taught. But was con law. I Different professors have different teaching styles, and that teaching style just did not jive well with myself. So it wasn't the content, but it was the structure of the overall class. And actually, at the at U of D, we had to take a tax law class that was mandatory, which a lot of people don't have to take. I think we're the only ones. So that was also not a
Did they
fun
know you
class.
don't go to law school to do math? You don't become a lawyer to do math? That's the running joke. I would have hated to take that class. I would have been like, absolutely not. Oh my
But
gosh.
I will say, in my current position, I'm thankful for those classes. I'm thankful that I even took tax law because those issues come up at the Michigan Supreme Court. And I can say at least I know something about it, which I think most lawyers would probably go through their entire career without having to deal with tax issues unless you decide to be a tax lawyer. But I'm very fortunate throughout my career that I've had a little bit of almost everything. And I think that has really helped me on the Michigan Supreme Court.
So I find that really interesting that a course that you ended up, not really liking actually ended up helping you. So I think that's pretty awesome when it kind of comes, full circle. Um, in terms of your journey, you finish school, you don't become a justice right away. What areas of law did you practice before becoming a justice?
Yeah, so I did criminal defense work out of law school. And so I had an opportunity to see how our criminal laws impacted my community. I mostly did court appointed work in the community that I live in. And so I got a really good opportunity to see the laws look like and how they affected people in my community. I then was a judicial law clerk in Wayne County Third Circuit Court, which is the busiest court in the state of Michigan. I worked with a judge who was in the civil division, and he was also Judge John A. Murphy, was the longest serving Black judge in the state of Michigan's history. So I am so fortunate to have been trained and mentored under him. And so we had all civil issues. They had special business courts, but anything other than that came to our desk. And so I had to research and write and make recommendations to my judge on how to rule on cases. I then worked for a firm, Lewis and Monday, which is one of the oldest and largest Black-owned law firms in the country. I practiced in a lot of different practice areas. I was the only associate at the firm at the time. And I worked under 3 to 4 partners that all practiced different types of law. So insurance law, labor and employment law, municipal law, school law, property law. We really had a lot of different criminal law. I mean, it did a lot of different work at the firm. And again, I'm very fortunate because, again, I think a lot of people tend to practice in one area their whole life, with which there's nothing wrong with that. But I had the opportunity to see different issues and work on those and get a understanding of those issues. And then I went to the legislature, where I literally saw every single issue that you could think of, in every single facet of how Michiganders live their life, from criminal law to tax law to fishing licenses to hunting permits to where you could drive your snowmobile and where you couldn't. Just everything affecting the way Michiganders live in our laws and having a say and a vote in that. So again, I think I've had so much experience in different areas of the law, down to making laws. And so I was able to get 5 bills passed into law when I was in the legislature. And I'm so grateful for that diversity of experience with the law.
Would you say that's where you got the bug to say, let me run for, I'm just wondering, like, did you wake up one day and say, I'm gonna just try to run for justice? Because it's such a huge thing, you know? So it's like, I'm sure
Yeah.
even with Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Jackson, like, you know, I know sometimes you're kind of like elbow, like, you should consider, you know, sometimes people, you know, if an opening is coming, you know, they kind of early start looking for people. Um, so how did that come about? I'm just because you're, again, I know I keep saying, but you're
Yeah.
so young to
Yes.
be in this position. So like, how did it actually come together for you?
So I'll try to shorten the story as much as possible, but I would say my journey wasn't that I woke up wanting to be on the Michigan Supreme Court and running for that position. As a matter of fact, when I did run last year, there was no open seat. Right, there are 2 positions open. There are 2 incumbents running.
Okay.
So I certainly did not wake up and say, "Let me run for the Michigan Supreme Court," and the seat is not open. What actually happened was I was in the legislature. I had planned to be in leadership and was working very, very hard on that. I get a call from my Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, to come to her house, and she wouldn't tell me why. And so I went to her house, and she has tea and crumpets, and she's making small talk with me. And I finally just say, "Why are we here?" Because you know me. So it's not like, I mean, she was just asking me, like, "Oh, how old are you? Where did you practice?" And so I'm telling her, but I just finally said, "What is this about?" And she said, "Have you ever considered running for Michigan Supreme Court?" And I said, "Maybe 20 years from now, maybe, you know,
Right.
but not really, no." And she said, "Oh no, next year." And I said,
Right.
"Definitely not. Like, no, I have 1 term left in the legislature. We had strict term limits. So I wanted to finish my term in the legislature, then, see what else, life had to, for me. And she looked at me in a very disappointed manner and she said, fine. But behind all of that, I have been very vocal about my reproductive journey on the House floor. When I was in the legislature, I suffered a miscarriage going into my first legislative session in 2019, and I suffered from uterine fibroids. I know a lot of Black women do. And I had to have a myomectomy in November 2020. So I was making the decision of whether or not I wanted to try to have another child. And honestly, I didn't know if I was able to because of the fibroids. I certainly didn't want to run a statewide campaign and be pregnant.
Mhm.
Who does that?
Right, right.
But I will say I did end up getting pregnant. And when I was safely in my second trimester, I started reconsidering it. Now, it was a huge risk. It was giving up my job in the legislature. It was running against incumbents for this position. But I never wanted to look at my daughter in the face and tell her I did not run for Michigan Supreme Court because of you, because I was pregnant with you, or I didn't take an opportunity because of you. How would I be able to tell her that she can do anything and be anything she wanted to be if I was limiting myself because I was pregnant? And so I decided to run for Michigan Supreme Court, and I ran a statewide campaign while pregnant, while having a full-time job in the legislature. And looking back, it was pretty insane. But I'm glad that I did it, because it definitely put me in the position when I did lose to be appointed. Now, I was appointed because Justice Bridget Mary McCormick decided to step down. So a sitting judge chief judge decided to step down. She decided to step down in August of 2022. I had to make the decision to run in April or March, late March, early April of 2022. So I had no idea that there was going to be a position potentially available to me. I just stepped out on faith and I said, you know what? Little Black boys and little Black girls need to see somebody running for the highest court in the state of Michigan. And I most likely will not win because it's very hard to unseat incumbent judges. But I'm going to try so that they can see somebody running at the very least. So I went in with a lot of risk. And again, it ended up playing out because the chief judge just happened to step down, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer appointed me to that position. But I lost by 2 percentage points. So I was very close to second place. I earned 1.3 million votes, over 1.3 million votes across the state of Michigan, which again put me in the position to be appointed because I had earned the respect of Michiganders. People know who I am, and that's kind of my journey. So no, I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I should be on the Michigan Supreme Court. I was asked, but I knew that I was asked, and then I was asked by multiple people as well, but something in me just had to shift and just say, I am obviously the best person.
I think it was your ancestors talking to you. I think they were whispering you in your sleep, like, do it, do it, do it. You just never know. Because sometimes people say, well, why? People sometimes ask me, why do I do certain things? Sometimes I just get like a feeling. And I always tell people I get my best ideas kind of like when I sleep. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm just completely calm. I'll wake up and be like, And so whatever pushed you, I think because you talk so much about your ancestors and you respect them so much and you always give them respect. I think they were a part of that, maybe even if it was maybe not on the surface, but maybe even subconsciously. And so that harkens back to what you said at the top of the interview about how much of this has been a part of your journey. Like, why not me? I'm 34, whatever, I'm Black, I'm a female, whatever. I get it. It's hard to unseat, whatever. But like you said, why not me? And so I think that's amazing that you took it. So you were appointed. In one word, if you can give me one word, how did it feel when you realized, okay, this is actually happening, and I'm making history on top of that. So how did it feel once you realized it was actually happening?
You know what? And let me back up for a second because you said, had you always wanted to be on the Michigan Supreme Court? Or you asked a question alluding to that. The chief judge that stepped down, Justice Bridget Mary McCormick, her campaign was the first campaign I worked on in law school. And so it was a wonderful full circle moment for me to assume her seat on the Supreme Court. Did not want to run for Supreme Court when I worked on her campaign, but it was a wonderful moment. And I say all that to say is a lot was happening at that time. I had a newborn. I still have a newborn. I'm still in my job in the legislature when it was announced that I was going to be appointed. I'm getting mentally prepared for a new job. And so it was very overwhelming during that time period. But I'm so thankful for the support of my family, my friends that really helped me through that whole transition. You know, people ask me how it feels to be the first Black woman on the Michigan Supreme Court. And as much joy as it brings me to see the faces of little brown girls and little brown boys and they look at me, when I say they start screaming, I mean it's just it's really, really cool. But I sit here and think in 2023, this is the progress that's being made in that I had to grow up with no representation on the Supreme Court. And I'm glad that little boys and little girls don't have to grow up in a world where there has never been a Black woman on the Michigan Supreme Court, because that representation is important. But I think of the women, the Black women that ran for this seat and were unsuccessful. I think about the 185-year history of the court that has never seen not just a Black woman, but a woman of color. I think about the 185-year history of the Michigan Supreme Court, where I'm only the 14th woman to serve. And so as much progress has been made and how happy I am to be that representation, there is a part of me that is saddened that it's taken this long to see this type of representation. So it's bittersweet. It is such an honor. I don't take that away, and I bring that with me every single day. But there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made.
Well, I guess that leads to my next question. What impact or what difference do you think will be made now that you are, or what do you hope the difference will be now that you are one of the justices?
My hope is that there will be other little Black boys and little Black girls, well, hopefully they're adults now, hopefully they're attorneys already, that will want to seek a position on the highest court in the state of Michigan. There have been many, again, that try and were unsuccessful. And so I think we went through a period of time where there were a lot of Black women that just didn't want to run for Michigan Supreme Court because they saw other people be unsuccessful. And I think putting yourself out there publicly, right, giving up your privacy, taking away time from your family, and most likely taking either a pay cut or having to leave your job is very risky for Black people in particular. That, and we've already talked about generational wealth and generational trauma. A lot of people don't have that option to take that type of risk. And so my hope is that I'm setting the stage and taking the hits that need to be taken to make it easier for the next Black man and Black woman that want to be on the Michigan Supreme Court.
So what would be your advice if someone is seeking to become a justice in their state or maybe the next Supreme Court justice like Ketanji Brown Jackson? Like if your road is I want to become a judge or I want to become a justice, is there any piece of advice? Because everyone doesn't want to necessarily like practice forever. Everyone doesn't necessarily want to teach. So this is, I always tell people, unlike med school, when you become a lawyer, there's so many things you can do with your law degree. So if someone is listening out there and they're thinking about kind of the judge path, the justice path, is there any words of advice that you could give now that you've kind of gone through the path, the fire?
Yes. Again, I hope it's easier for the next person coming after me. Um, I would say get involved in your community, make your presence known broadly. Um, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in had I not been in those quote unquote rooms where they were making important decisions. Part of it was me behind the scenes saying there's never been a Black woman on the Michigan Supreme Court. When are you going to support a Black woman being on the Michigan Supreme Court? For years behind the scenes, didn't necessarily think it was going to be me, but I that's something I wanted to see. But you have to be in those rooms, right, where they're making those decisions and have that type of support because you have been in the community and people trust you to lead. So whether that's volunteering for a judge, working on campaigns for people that you support, shadowing individuals that are in the position that you want to be in. Listen, no one says no to free help, right? No one says no to volunteers. I think that is the best way to figure out what you do and do not want to do.
Okay.
And I say that knowing very well that some people cannot dedicate time that is not being paid for. I understand that. But if you do have time, I think it is so valuable to volunteer your time with individuals that are in positions that you want to be in, because you may get to the position and decide, I don't even want to do this, right? And then you're spending a lot of time and money trying to do something else. But that would be my piece of advice. Find somebody, volunteer with them, understand the appointments process or the campaign process, whichever makes sense for your state. It could be a hybrid like it like it was for me, but I know in some states judges are only appointed. So get to know the process, get to know the people that are making those decisions.
It's funny that you said, volunteer, do as much as you can because you may get to a point and realize you don't want to do it. I ran for like local office in DC. They had like these neighborhood commissioners that were underneath kind of like the ward representatives in the different places in DC. And they were like, oh, you should run. No one's running. You're a lawyer. They'll pick you by default. So I put a lot of energy into it. I just put up a little poster, put a little headshot on there, whatever. Went on about my business. It was really something my father wanted me to do at the time. He's passed now, but something he wanted me to do. And so, election day comes and I'm like, I don't even know if this is something. I mean, I could do it, whatever. And there was a guy that really, really wanted to do it. So he just put way more effort. I mean, he probably knocked on more doors and things like that. And he actually ended up winning. And my sister always says I'm a sore loser, but that's like one time where I was like, you know what? He clearly wanted it more than me. Let him have it. But it was a very interesting experience, just even on a super, super local level, like just putting yourself even out there publicly, even that was kind of hard for me. So yeah, I got a little taste of it. It's not easy. And so I applaud those like you that actually put yourselves out there and do that, whether you win or lose. It's
Well,
amazing.
especially statewide, right? Michigan is a really big state.
Yes. So to put yourself out like that, yeah, and have a newborn and still be in another job, yes, I think yes, what did they say? You get brownie points just for doing all that. So I'm glad that you were ultimately appointed. Here you are. Before we close out, is there any like organization, like a nonprofit or something that you specifically maybe support that you want to tell our listeners about?
Yeah, well, I will say that I am a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So I am so thankful for the support that my sorority has given over the years. I always like to give them a shout out. Other than that, I'm a part of several organizations that I don't have time to list, but Alpha Kappa Alpha is always at the top of my list for me to share as a member, because it's been so integral to the person that I am today. And so shout out to Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And I also saw Ebony K. Williams on your show, and I can't wait to meet her. She's also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, and so shout out to her.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I guess, what I love about this interview is everything you say is connected to the next thing I'm about to say. So, we always end our podcast with our Black Excellence Moment of the Week, and she is a soror of yours. Dr. Tamia Potter, is the first Black woman neurosurgery resident that Vanderbilt has ever had. So she was matched with them. This is, even though we're in the legal field, in the medical field, they have this matching season where you get to find out where you're going to be a resident. So there's a nonprofit that does this whole ceremony, and so she found out that she will be their first neurosurgery Black woman neurosurgery resident, and she is AKA. So
Yeah.
we want to give her a special shout out. I also want to plug the fact that we do have actually a year-round scholarship for Black law students and now Black medical students, with our merchandise on our store. So part of the Black TV lawyer, with all the Black TV lawyers and obviously all the Black TV doctors in the doctor collection, those collections specifically help to fundraise for those scholarships, because harking back to what you said, you can be the smartest one and go to school, and have all the tools, and then maybe you can't pay for it. Maybe you can't pay for the books. Maybe you can't pay for the bar exam. Maybe you can't pay for the board. There's so many barriers systematically that I guess all this critical race theory is talking about that it's embedded, that sometimes prevents folks that look like us from becoming doctors and lawyers. So here at the Black Lawyers Podcast, we're just really excited that people have embraced coming on the podcast, such as yourself, supports the collection. I think all of these little things that we're doing is going to help the next generation behind us. And, with that being said, thank you so much for coming on. I actually learned more about you. I felt like I kind of already knew some stuff about you, but this is why I do these interviews, because I actually end up finding out way more. And so super excited to learn so much more about you. We are, still rooting for you, because I mean, you're right at the beginning of everything you're doing. I know there's still a long path, so we're still rooting for you. And as always, we're rooting for everyone Black. Take care, everyone.